Hello, everyone. This is the 146th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle from the 1888 letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I welcome back American author and journalist Mr. Clemente Lisi as we discuss Napoli's UEFA Cup winning run in the 1988-89 season. Mussolisi has been a journalist for the likes of New York Post and the New York Daily News. He also worked as a senior editor for abcnews.com. He is also a contributor to Religion Unplugged. He is the author of the U.S. women's soccer team, an American success story, and the FIFA World Cup, a history of the planet's biggest sporting event. And Mussolisi also has a website called Planet Soccer on Substack at planetsoccer.substack.com. Welcome back, Clemente.
Great to be back. Thank you.
Before we begin, I want to mention that some of the topics that we're going to touch upon, we already discussed in our Maradona podcast, the 7 years at Napoli. But in this discussion, we'll try to take a closer look at the entirety of this UEFA Cup adventure of the 1988-89 season. Let's go back in time. Can you describe the state of the affairs at Napoli in the autumn of 1988?
Yeah, Napoli entered the 88-89 season among one of the favorites to win the Serie A title. They had come off of a disappointing loss in the previous season where they were in the lead and then squandered that lead, and AC Milan was champion. That season had a delayed start because of the Summer Olympics in Seoul, and Napoli was coming off, like I said, a second place finish the previous season. But there was also a player rebellion that occurred near the end of that season. And as a result, Napoli sold off many players, most notably Salvatore Bagni and Bruno Giordano, who were big fan favorites. And then they were pretty active on the transfer market, bringing in Luca Fusi, Massimo Crippa, Alemão, the Brazilian midfielder. And of course, Napoli also had Diego Maradona, the world's best player. So they were in very good position to compete for trophies that season.
Among the rebels, we had veterans such as Moreno Ferrario and starting goalkeeper Claudio Garella, who were also cleared out. And you have a new goalkeeper, Giuliano Giuliani, who came from Verona, from Torino. Not only Massimo Crippa, but you also have Giancarlo Corradini in defense. This was the first season where Italian teams were authorized three foreigners. So you have the Brazilian Alemão came from Atletico Madrid. The club president, Corrado Ferleno, he had maintained his confidence in manager Ottavio Bianchi despite the rebellion that you mentioned. However, Diego Maradona would have a war of words with him in the preseason stage. Can you describe this feud between Maradona and Bianchi?
Yeah, so Maradona was also part of the player rebellion, but not on paper. But Maradona was the team leader. Of course, he was the kind of player that you can never sell off, right? So Maradona, is interesting. Maradona and Bianchi did not get along because this was a team very much molded in Maradona's image. Maradona was almost the player and the coach on the field. You didn't need a manager in some ways. Maradona was going to do whatever he was going to do. And so Bianchi liked more of a defensive setup, which Maradona favored a more offensive one, obviously. So there was tensions there. I think if Maradona had his way, there would have been a new manager. But of course, Corrado Ferlaino, the owner, reconfirmed Bianchi. And then that led to more of a feud between Ferlaino and Maradona, which had really transpired for years and years. And those were the years where Maradona really was looking to leave. He was looking to go to Olympic Marseille or somewhere else, but Ferlino had refused to sell him. So tensions between them really started to boil that summer. And of course, they would spill over into the next summer. But for the time being, there was kind of a truce in the dressing room, and the season began. The tensions were there, but what was happening on the field was obviously much more important.
So Ferleno had to maintain order and put everyone in their place ahead of the season.
Yeah, absolutely. Because in Italian football, even to this day, teams that are not owned by a conglomerate but owned by one owner, and a lot of Serie A teams at the time were owned by one powerful owner, that person really has total control over the team, almost more than the manager. And so, yes, he had put everyone in their place. And so, whoever pays the bills makes the decisions. And so, that's what happened in this case.
Let's take a closer look at the transfer activity and your impressions at the time. So you already mentioned some of the old guard leave, like Giordano, who's loaned to Ascoli, but he would never return. And Bani is offloaded to Avellino. Garella goes to Udinese. Ferrario is loaned to Roma. And there's other players. The veteran Giuseppe Bruscolotti, who'd been there since the 1970s, he retired. I don't remember if it's part of the rebellion, but in any case, he had arrived at the end of the road with Napoli. As far as the arrivals, of course, we mentioned Alemao and Kripa and Corradini from Torino and Fusi from Sampdoria and Giuliani from Verona. But you also have other players, peripheral team players like Antonio Caranante, who came from Ascoli, Simone Giacchetta, who came from a lower league, Civita Novese. And later in the season, you'd have Maurizio Neri from Ancona, who would come in to bolster the front line when needed. Overall, it seems like some of the older players are being replaced with just as talented younger players. Was that your impression at the time?
Yeah, at the time, I actually feared that Napoli had weakened itself because Giordano and Bagni, for example, were both very talented fan favorites. They were part of the first league title in '87, but it turns out that I was wrong. The arrival of Alemão with that third foreigner slot allowed Napoli to replace Bagni with a midfielder who had some flair and a South American playing style that I think Carrega and Maradona really liked, made them more compatible with some of the better players on the team. It turned out that both players from Torino, Corradini in the defense and Kripa in the midfield, really made the team much better. In hindsight, I think Napoli looked even stronger than they did when they won the league. But at the time, there was a lot of unknowns because when you're a team that is that competitive and you start changing four or five regulars in the starting lineup, and then you bring in a lot of the young players that you mentioned that got very little playing time, it could put some stress on the team, and especially not only that you're competing domestically, but then you're competing in the UEFA Cup, which at the time I should point out was a very, very competitive tournament, more so than the Europa League of today.
Let's look at the backbone of the team at this point that would start the season. We already discussed the new goalkeeper, Giuliano Giuliani, just like Garella, came from Verona to replace his predecessor. In defense, we already have Ciro Ferrara, already international, and Giovanni Francini, and Alessandro Renica. He'd been there for a few seasons. And midfield, of course, there's still Fernando De Napoli, the international, and Francesco Romano, along with Maradona, of course. And up front, you have the Brazilian striker Careca and Andrea Carnevale back as a starter.
In hindsight, it was a very strong backbone. And like I said, a lot of Napoli to play with a 4-3-3 that was less defensive. So in a lot of ways, Bianchi probably didn't get his way. I think he would start the lineup and then the players would pretty much improvise, especially in attack and in the midfield. I think Alemão and Kripa in the midfield really added some more flair. And then look, the attack was very strong. You have Maradona and then you have Careca and Carnevale on the wings. And that's really where your goal production was going to happen. Part of the issue was if those players were going to be marked or double marked or there was some kind of goal drought, then the team would suffer. Then they had to find goals from other places, and they would. They would find them from Kripa, from Alemão, from Francini, from places that you would not expect. And so, in a way, the backbone of the team was very strong. This was still a time when there was no turnover. That kind of came into vogue in the 90s with the AC Milan teams, the Inter Milan teams that had long benches, a lot of money. You mentioned earlier a couple of young players that Napoli purchased that summer, and those are not any kind of all-star team names. Those are players that are forgotten today, and they got very little playing time. But I would say this is very much a blue collar team, one that was really worked hard. And any team with Maradona in the lineup always instilled fear in the opponent. So it was a team built for the title for sure, and it was a very strong team.
For kit collectors, this was the first season with Mars as sponsor. And of course, these kits have become classics. Given the expenditures and this team overhaul, was it a clear statement of purpose that they're rebuilding the team for the Scudetto and also European success?
So I think the team was built for both. but the Scudetto was the main priority, especially after losing it the way they did the previous season. I don't think the European success or the idea, the potential for it really sunk in until the quarterfinals of the tournament, and we'll talk about that. Sort of an interesting side note, Ferdinand had promised Maradona, had they won the UEFA Cup, that he would sell him off. We would later find out that that was not the case, and that Ferdinand would say that he said that to motivate Maradona, only angering him even further the next summer. So clearly there was an objective on the part of Federlaino to try to win both. And when you're a player, you want to win every tournament you're in, whether it's the League Cup, the Scudetto, or the UEFA Cup. Though Napoli had not had much success in Europe in the past, so that was a tall order. But we're talking about a period in history when the Italian teams dominated all three European competitions of the time. So it was possible, but I think it was built for both. But the Scudetto was the main priority. Later, we would find out that Inter would be such a formidable foe that that would force Napoli, I think, to focus on the UEFA Cup.
On our podcast on Maradona, we also discussed this narrative that despite his excellence, Maradona had this image of having failed in the European Cups. This may have been his last great chance for European success. Was that a part of the narrative they remember at the time?
Yeah, yes, it was. Maradona had largely failed in Europe, even though he had been a world champion 2 years earlier, and the World Cup was another 2 years away. But on the club level, he had not achieved that success either with Barcelona or with Napoli later. And this was a great opportunity to win an international trophy. It should be noted, like I mentioned earlier in passing, that the UEFA Cup, which is now the Europa League, was at the time a very difficult tournament to win. If the Champions League of today features the top three, four clubs from Europe's best leagues at the time, the UEFA Cup featured the team that finished second, third, fourth, sometimes even fifth. So, for example, the UEFA Cup that season featured Bayern Munich, Inter, Juventus, Ajax, Benfica, right? The English teams were still banned, but that those are Champions League or at the time European Champions Cup caliber teams. While there was a chance to win a trophy, it wasn't going to be easy.
Where were you in life as this season unfolded?
Yeah, I was in eighth grade. I was fairly young, so I'm giving my age here. I was in middle school and watched many of Napoli's games, not only in Serie A on Sundays, but in the UEFA Cup, thanks to RAI or RAI, the Italian state broadcaster, who would broadcast games on public television in New York and in other markets around the country. It was a time when there was very little soccer broadcast in the United States, and I was growing up at a time when the North American Soccer League had ended in 1984, 85, and there was really a American soccer drought. So whatever we can see, whether on Spanish television or Italian TV, that was where our soccer allegiances were. But looking back, we were very lucky to have had both those broadcasts. And also, I was very lucky to be that young and to be a Napoli fan when Napoli had been a team that for decades had won very little. And we were living through a golden era and we knew it. And so it was fun to know that every year you could win something. And so it was a very competitive team. And luckily for Italians abroad, especially in the United States, we had a chance to see them.
And speaking of which, I remember like on Friday nights there was I Temi del Calcio with Franco Zuccala. They would
Right.
kind of preview the weekend's matches or the previous, let's say, matches in the midweek in Europe, etc. It was like I think maybe 15, 20 minutes. Sunday morning, you had in Rai International the Serie A match of the week. Also the European matches as well sometimes. Yeah.
Right.
We come to the UEFA Cup season 1988-89. In the first round, Napoli face Greek side PAOK of Salonika, which on paper would have seemed like a comfortable matchup. Because of the whole Olympics issue, the first leg and the second leg were played like a month apart almost. The first match on September 7th at San Paolo at Napoli, Napoli just wins with a penalty kick from Maradona. The second leg a month later on October 5th ends in a 1-1 tie. Careca scores for Napoli in the first half before Pau ties the match in the second half. It seemed close, but I don't think Napoli were particularly that troubled.
No, not at all. Yeah, on paper, the result seems like a close game, but this was still a very defensive era for Serie A teams, and you needed one goal, like in the second leg, and you knew that one goal would have been enough to go through. And after Careca's goal in the 17th minute, it was a matter of maintaining the result and getting through. And this was a time when you didn't have a lot of turnover in the lineup, so players were fatigued, and the Italian defenders were very adept at shutting down a result. This was an era where we had foreigners in Serie A, but the best defenders in the world were still Italians. And that came through in the European competitions, and it did it during the early rounds of the UEFA Cup for Napoli for sure.
In the second round, they face East German side Lokomotiv Leipzig. The first leg was played at Leipzig. Actually, Leipzig took the lead in the 69th minute through Matthias Zimmerling. But just a few minutes later, in the 73rd minute, Maradona crossed from the left side and Franchini headed in the tying goal. So it was very typical of Italian teams to get a tie away from home or score an away goal and to be in a comfortable advantage position for the second leg. In the second leg on November 9th at San Paolo, Napoli comfortably wins 2-0. Franchini scores in the second minute. And in the 61st minute, Maradona takes a free kick, and Franchini's shot was parried by East German goalkeeper Rene Müller, but Heiko Scholes knocked in the rebound into his own net. Napoli wins 2-0. We come to the third round of this UEFA Cup. Napoli are facing French side Bordeaux. This is a Bordeaux side that's managed by future World Cup winning manager Aimé Jacquet and contains a number of familiar faces like Enzo Scifo, the Belgian superstar, Jean Tigana. Incidentally, Enzo Scifo was on loan from Inter, and Yannick Stopira, French striker from the 86 World Cup. For the first leg on November 23rd, Napoli traveled to Bordeaux. Napoli scores a quick goal in the 6th minute when Carnevale takes the shot on the left on the edge of the box. And I think Kripa had obstructed the French goalkeeper, Dominique Dropsy, and the ball went past him. Napoli scored a key away goal. Again, they were on the driver's seat going into the second leg at home. We have to add that this particular season, Bordeaux were struggling as well and would have a nightmare season. So the odds were always against them. And the odds were stacked more against them when they had a player sent off in the 3rd minute in the second leg at San Paolo on December 7th. And Napoli just went through motions just to hold on to the score. Again, it looks like it was a very close tie, but I don't think Napoli seemed to be too much perturbed by Bordeaux.
No, not at all. The other interesting fact is that both Leipzig and Bordeaux were sort of, to most fans, unknown teams because this is the pre-internet era, and those were, especially the East Germans, and those were leagues that really most people were not accustomed to watching or knowing much about. And so it was an interesting, in hindsight, they were not that formidable, and Napoli was a much better team. But going into those matches, there was always that opportunity to stumble. We have to remember that there was no group stage here. One mistake could cost you, and you were eliminated early. And so that was, with the bracket style elimination, there was very little room for error. You saw against Bordeaux, Carnevale scored the winner, but in the previous round against Leipzig, you had someone like Franchini, who was sort of a goal poacher, even though he was a defender, because he was always in the box on set plays and when Napoli pushed up in attack. So they were getting goals wherever they could and then holding on to the result. Because, like I said, while the attack is much spoken about, I think the Napoli defense and the midfield did an exceptional job in keeping these other teams at bay. And then we should point out that the win against Bordeaux occurred in November, and that was right before the long winter break that takes place for the European competitions that would return in the late winter, early spring.
As the season reaches midpoint, Napoli were in a battle with Inter to win the Scudetto. Maradona, Careca, and Carnevale were just scoring for fun. You have matches like 8-2 against Pescara, 5-3 against Juventus at Turin, I believe. You have the 4-1 against AC Milan, which was a revenge for the previous season's loss. So Napoli were scoring a lot of goals around this stage of a season. But this Inter was an Inter that would break all the records this season, and they were even better than Napoli. As a result, do you think as the spring approached and Inter were not putting a foot wrong, do you think the objective was shifted to European success?
I do think that, and plus the fact that they had reached the quarterfinals now, I think made believers of both the players and the fans that maybe the UEFA Cup was actually a winnable tournament. We should point out the quarterfinals ended up pitting Napoli against rivals Juventus in an all-Italian matchup. And Napoli only a few years earlier had been able to break Juventus' stronghold on the league. Maradona had proven he was better than Michel Platini, but that wasn't enough. Napoli had to do it all over again now on the European stage in a much, much bigger match.
This is a Juventus that, like you said, is rebuilding and is no longer the same Juventus as the previous years. It's the first season of Dino Zoff as manager. You still have the likes of Stefano Tacconi from the old guard, but you also have new players like Giancarlo Marocchi, the Portuguese Rui Barros, the Soviet Alexander Zavarov, Michael Laudrup, the Danish star. We come to the spring. The first leg is on February 28th at Turin with Juventus hosting Napoli, and Napoli wearing red for this match. Juventus would win this match 2-0. Pasquale Bruno scored in the 13th minute with a long range shot. In the 45th minute, Rui Barros crossed from the right side and Corradini accidentally knocked it into his own net. In Europe, a 2-0 lead for an Italian team that seemed like it would be comfortable margin. But obviously, this is a Napoli that is far more superior to Juventus at this point in history. The second leg on March 15th would be a dramatic match. Maradona gives the lead with a penalty kick in the 10th minute. Carnevale ties the match in the 45th minute. So the scores are tied after the first half. The match has to go into extra time. And in the final minute of the extra time, Careca crosses from the right side and Alessandro Renica scores the dramatic winner. And Napoli wins 3-0 and are through to the semifinals. Would this perhaps be the catalyst that Napoli felt like it was their destiny to win the cup that season?
Yeah, I do think so. I think this game was really a turning point for the team in this tournament. We should point out that the game appeared headed to penalties. And then Renica, who was a great sweeper. The truth is, if it had not been for Franco Baresi, Renica might have been on the national team. And scoring that goal to this day is a big goosebump moment for Napoli fans. And you can go on YouTube and watch it. And after scoring the goal, Renica runs across the whole length of the field to hug Giuliani, who was in goal. And the crowd is roaring. And it remains, I think, one of the biggest goals in Napoli's history and one of the most iconic. Now, like I said, it was a turning point for the team, but on the horizon was Bayern Munich, was probably the best team in this competition, and they would go on to win the Bundesliga that year. So while there was a lot of excitement, maybe the toughest match of the tournament was yet to come.
This is the Bayern Munich that has Klaus Augenthaler, Stefan Reuter, current Barcelona manager Hans-Dieter Flick, Olaf Thon, among others, managed by Jupp Heynckes. The first leg is on April 5th at San Paulo. Napoli takes the lead in the 41st minute when Maradona sets up Careca and sends him through to score. In the 60th minute, again Maradona. He crosses from the right side and Carnevale heads in the winner. Napoli has a comfortable advantage over Bayern Munich going into the second leg. However, as you mentioned, this is Bayern Munich that would win the Bundesliga and had eliminated Inter with the away goals rule in the earlier rounds. So on April 19th at Munich, this is when we have the famous warm up by Maradona on the stadium. They're playing Opus's Life is Life. And I think without his shoelaces tied, Maradona is warming up to the music. And that has become a very memorable part of Maradona's legend. Getting back to the match, Napoli take the lead in the 61st minute through Careca, again from a pass by Diego Maradona. Bayern Munich ties the match 2 minutes later in the 63rd minute through Ronald Wolfart. However, in the 76th minute, again, Maradona from the left. He sends Careca through on the right side, who then advances and scores. The match is more or less all over because Bayern have a mountain to climb with a quarter an hour left. But they do tie the match in the 81st minute through Stefan Reuter and get a credible 2-2 tie, but are eliminated against superior Napoli side. You see that Maradona is everywhere assisting on all the goals. So Napoli are through to the final and they faced another West German side, Stuttgart, of Jurgen Klinsmann. By now, Inter is running away with the Serie A and would shortly thereafter win the league title. Therefore, this European victory was imperative for Napoli. Do you think having eliminated Bayern Munich, the match against Stuttgart was seen as a formality?
Yeah, Napoli Bayern was almost like a final, but it wasn't, right? And so they had to play the final. I do think in the minds of many of the fans, the idea was this was a formality. But we should point out that Neapolitans are extremely superstitious people, and so that certainly kept their feet firm on the ground. And we should point out that the Europa League final today is a one match, one game, but at the time it was a two-legged affair, the UEFA Cup final. So there was still, and the second leg was going to be played in Germany. So there was always sort of that, the idea was, can we win at home? Can we build a big enough lead and not suffer any goals? And then go to Germany and lock up the result like they had in so many other previous rounds. So formality, yes, because Stuttgart was really a team that very few people knew much about, except that we knew that Jurgen Klinsmann was going to go to Inter the next year, and he was going to be one of the best strikers in the world over the next decade, but he was still very young at the time. But other than that, it was seen as a very almost easy win. And the partnership between Carrega and Maradona had really that season reached its zenith, really. And so Napoli went into this two-legged affair just fully hoping and expecting to win.
And Stuttgart, apart from Jurgen Klinsmann, it's a team that's managed by the Dutch star Arie Hahn from the 70s era. You have the likes of Ike Imel in goal, future Sampdoriani, Sreko Katanec, at this time Yugoslavian, Guido Buchwald, the Icelandic star Asger Sigurvinsson, Karl Algover, Maurizio Gaudino, a German player of Italian origin who'd be an international in a few years' time. So it was a solid team, but definitely not at the level of Napoli. The first leg of this two-legged final is on May 3rd at San Paolo. Against all odds, Stuttgart take the lead in the 17th minute. Maurizio Gaudino takes a long-range shot that Giuliani should have saved, but it slips through his hand. And surprisingly, Stuttgart have the lead. So Napoli have to fight back to get a result. In the 68th minute, Maradona's shot was handled by Günther Schäfer. Let me ask you this. Do you think he aimed for the hand?
I don't know. It's possible. The interesting thing with Maradona, there's always a hand involved somewhere. So, it's very possible because Maradona was a very astute and very
Yeah.
sort of trickster type of a player. And so it's very possible
Because wasn't
that
this what they were saying at the time, that he may have aimed for the hand or something like that?
right, and the hand was a little bit further out, which made it for an easy call for a penalty.
So unsurprisingly, scored from a penalty kick, and the match is tied. So we come near the end in the 87th minute. Once again, Maradona crosses from the right side and Careca knocks in the winner. Napoli, I think they would have expected a much more comfortable margin of victory. 2-1 win. It's still in balance, but nevertheless, I think Stuttgart had their work cut out. The second leg on May 17th at Stuttgart, Napoli, once they scored in the 18th minute, I think it looked like they were going to win. In the 18th minute, Careca sent Alemar through on the left side to go on and score. Stuttgart actually tied the match through Jurgen Klinsmann with a header in the 27th minute. Napoli scored the second goal in the 39th minute through Ciro Ferrara. It was actually a header from Maradona that set up Ferrara. And at this point, it did not look like Stuttgart could mount a comeback of any sort, especially when Napoli scored a third goal in the 62nd minute. Again, Maradona setting up Careca to chip over Ike Immel. Surprisingly, Stuttgart would tie the match in the 70th minute. Gaudino's shot was deflected by De Napoli into his own net. And just before the end, in the 89th minute, De Napoli attempted a back pass, but that was headed in by Olaf Schmaler. The match ended as a 3-3 tie, but again, Napoli, I don't think they were ever troubled, except maybe for a few minutes in the first leg. Napoli finally won a European trophy. Maradona finally won a European trophy. All in all, this victory would have been a good consolation for not winning the Scudetto that season.
Yeah, absolutely. That second leg turned out to be a pretty crazy game in the end. If you think about it with a 3-3, you're right. When Careca made it 3-1, the game was out of reach. But I think a lot of Napoli fans still remember the De Napoli own goal, which was a ridiculous back pass from almost, I don't know, a third of the way in his own half. And it was, seen as just a really weird play and a strange blunder that could have really cost them in the end. I mean, it did not. The other thing to note was that Gaudino was actually, like you mentioned, but his Italian descent, but his parents were from Naples. So he was actually a Neapolitan, which made it a sort of a storyline within the larger story. And then you had a lot of Italian immigrants in Germany. So there was plenty of support for Napoli in Germany for that game. And then there's so many iconic moments. I mean, Cito Ferrara's face when he scores that goal, he looks incredulous. And then even when Careca scores the 3-1, he kind of drops to his knees like he knows it's over and they're going to do something particularly historic. And so, even though there's plenty of game left to play. And so those are the kind of the moments I think a lot of Napoli fans still remember to this day. And it was really the pinnacle of that season for Napoli and really a truly astonishing feat considering that this was a team that had never won a European trophy. And the way the season had begun, it did not look like they could compete for such a huge tournament. And in the end, they did.
And they could even afford to lose the Coppa Italia final to Sampdoria, as I imagine they were disinterested at this point.
Right, probably. They were still celebrating.
You mentioned you watched these matches on Rai International. So, how did you experience these matches as the season is progressing?
Yeah, so some of these early round matches were not broadcast. They were broadcasting other games. So I did not, at the time, was not able to watch those live. I do remember the game against Juventus. The game that they were showing had ended, and then they quickly went to the extra time. So I remember actually witnessing that I make a goal live, and it was obviously, pandemonium. So much so that I read years later that fans celebrating in the stadium were so loud that the ground actually shook in the neighborhood. And people should know that Naples is a very earthquake prone area because of Mount Vesuvius. So that sort of caused some issue. And actually, people living in the neighborhood around the stadium feared that future games would also involve this kind of fandom. And, for all the home matches, they were bringing in 70, 80,000 fans. So back here in the United States, it wasn't always easy watching the games because kickoff was 2:30 Eastern time. I would often not make it in time. Having done this talk with you actually reminds me that for the second leg, I was so worried about not making it home in time that I actually got my parents to write me a note that I was going to the dentist that day and that I had to leave early. And there was no dentist appointment. The whole point was for me to get home in time for kickoff of the second leg. And I remember, thank God I had parents who were big soccer fans who allowed me to do that. But that was, I think the statute of limitations is passed on that. I don't think that my middle school teacher would come after me. But I remember getting a note from my mother to say that I had to leave early so I can watch the game from the beginning. And so things like that, I remember fondly. And that's always the issue when you're watching these games, in the afternoon, Eastern time, when these games are happening in the evenings in Europe. So that's just a little anecdote of sort of how interested I was in this title run and this, cup run and the lengths I would go to be able to watch these games.
One thing also that stands out for me that season is how all the Italian teams just about did well. That's the year we have AC Milan winning the Champions Cup, the 5-0 win against Real Madrid. I remember I watched that just like you on
Right.
Rai International. And I think Sampdoria also reached the final of the Cup Winners' Cup. So they lost, but all three teams reached the final. Italian football was at its height at this point. Even though there may have been jubilation because of this victory, there was a bizarre incident some weeks later in a dead rubber league match against Ascoli on June 11 that kind of showed that there may be some trouble in the background. Where in this match, Careca was injured and he was replaced by substitute goalkeeper Rafael Di Fusco because apparently Bianchi said they didn't have any other fit players. I remember after that, Careca made a statement that besides the UEFA Cup win, this season has been a disaster. It kind of showed that there may be some trouble off the field. Do you remember this incident and the aftermath?
Yeah, it remains one of the oddest moments, I think, in club history. If Ranica's goal against Juventus is one of the greatest goals in club history, this is one of the most bizarre. And I remember not watching the game, but seeing the highlights of the incident, and I recall the scandal that it caused. Now, I think in hindsight, Bianchi was probably trying to send a message to everyone that he was not happy and that he was almost trying to get the last word in. We should point out that when Napoli won the UEFA Cup, he quickly ran to the dressing room and he wasn't there for most of the celebration and then only emerged later from the dressing room where he had no expression on his face, as if he was at his funeral or something. And so that was also pointed out as being strange. Now, I think in this case, putting the backup goalie to play, for the injured Carrega was very strange. But in the end, I think it was a scandal that was stirred up more by the journalists at the time than the reality. I think Bianchi knew he was on his way out. I think he was trying to send a passive aggressive message to the team because the reality is these players would go on to win the league in 1990 and they would emerge as the country's best club. So it wasn't necessarily a player personnel issue. I think it was mostly a coaching issue and the relationship between the coach and the players and the manager and the ownership.
The Serie A triumph of 1987 had clearly been a surprise given the status of Napoli. Was this UEFA Cup victory the same at the European scale, or were Napoli regarded as a top outfit by then?
I think by then Napoli was regarded as a top outfit really for two reasons. One, they play in Serie A, the world's top league. So I guess the equivalent today would be like saying that a sixth place Premier League team, like a West Ham or something, is a world class team because they play in a very good league. And so that was sort of the shine that Napoli was able to muster because of the fact they played in Serie A and because they had Maradona, the best player in the world. You can't have the best player in the world and not be considered a top club. And in addition to that, they had a few other players that played for the Italian national team, like Carnevale and then Francini. And then you had players like Careca and Alemão who were starters for the Brazilian national team. So you had a collection of international stars here, as much as you could, given the limitations that you had with roster spots. But I think at this point, Napoli is regarded as a top club for sure.
Do you think this important symbolic victory, in a way, convinced Maradona that a cycle had finished and perhaps his time was up at Napoli.
Yeah, I do think that Maradona thought that for sure, but Fellaini did not, and that's sort of the main tension here. As I mentioned earlier, he had promised to sell Maradona had Napoli won the UEFA Cup, and there's a kind of a curious scene after the final where Maradona's walking to receive the trophy, and Fellaini walks up to him and whispers something in his ear, right? And Maradona kind of laughs and walks away. And I think that's when I think Maradona found out that he was not going to sell him, right? That there was not going to be this separation that he expected. I think he very much thought this was the end of an era cycle. And I think Fellaini saw Maradona as such a huge investment and somebody he just could not part with. That even if it meant that Maradona had to be unhappy, you'd rather keep him than sell him off to Olympique Marseille or any other club. We should note that Berlusconi's AC Milan team had been interested in purchasing him the previous year, and then that never worked out. So Maradona was always looking, and he wanted to go to a different league when it was where it was calmer. There was too much pressure on him every week to week to produce. And as you can see from what we just discussed, he was producing at a very high level. But of course, it came at a cost. So in the end, I do think that, if Maradona had left that season, Napoli would have replaced him with somebody else and maybe would have been competitive for a few more years, but we'll never know that. What we do know is that Maradona stayed. They won the league in 1990, and then we know what happened after that. There was a total burnout and drug use and everything else. And so we'll never really know. But I do think Fedlaino, in a lot of ways, did not want to let go and did not want the cycle to end. And that's sort of, history will judge these two characters as they may. But I think Maradona was probably better off leaving at that time,
And perhaps even maybe the Italian Federation may have pressured Napoli to hold on to Maradona with the World Cup on the horizon,
for
perhaps.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Despite this triumph, Ottavio Bianchi decided to call time on his Napoli days. Was this because of the continuing tensions with Maradona and others?
Yeah, no, I think that's the case. And Farlane knew very well that he was not going to part with Maradona, so Bianchi was going to go, and there was tension there. And also, Bianchi had won everything he could with Napoli. They had won the league, they had won the UEFA Cup, and so there was not much more that you could do that was better, right? But he would go on to coach Roma, where he would then win the Coppa Italia and then reach another UEFA Cup final, only to lose to Inter. So Bianchi had a decent career post
And back
Napoli.
at Napoli for a few months.
And then
In
back at Napoli for the right, that was, never bring a coach back. But yeah, but so, there was always this, and Bianchi had been a Napoli player in his youth, as a young man. So there was that connection to the club, but this was a parting of the ways. And then they would get Alberto Bigon would come in and sort of rebuild the team in a way and then embark on a whole new series of victories.
closing, was this UEFA Cup title in 1989 the zenith of Maradona's adventure with Napoli?
Yeah, some consider it to be, and I have to agree that it is. Even though I do think that the title in 1990, not the zenith, but was the end. We didn't know that, but I do think it is the pinnacle of his time there. And then Maradona would be suspended for drug use in 1991, and then Napoli would go on to become an average club again. And it would be decades before Napoli returned to playing regularly in Europe, which makes this UEFA Cup triumph even more important so many decades later. I also want to point out that this season, Napoli is not playing in the Champions League or the UEFA Cup or the Europa League or whatever because after finishing 10th. So in a lot of ways, looking back on this season, I think is a chance for Napoli fans to enjoy a little bit of European football at a time when there isn't any, as they rebuild. But looking back in hindsight, it was the zenith of Maradona's adventure at Napoli, and we can look back fondly on it as one of the greatest triumphs ever in the UEFA Cup. And to this day, Napoli's only European title.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information and the link to Mr. Lisi's books are on the blog and podcast uploads. So thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Thank you again.